On September 8, 1943, Italy signed the armistice with the Allies. At that moment, while rank-and-file soldiers wandered confused through the streets of Rome without clear orders, while the Germans disarmed entire divisions and sent thousands of Italians to labor camps, one question echoed in the silence. Where were the generals? Those men who had marched into Greece, who had sent troops to the African desert, who had sworn loyalty to the Duce. What became of them when the fascist regime collapsed? Their fates reveal an uncomfortable story of opportunism, survival, and justice that never quite arrived. When Italy switched sides, its generals found themselves at a moral and practical crossroads. Marshal Pietro Badoglio, who had replaced Mussolini as prime minister, signed the armistice in secret. But the plan to protect Rome failed spectacularly. On the night of September 8th, Badoglio and King Victor Emmanuel III fled the capital, abandoning the army without directives. General Giacomo Carboni, responsible for defending Rome, found himself without sufficient resources. The Germans, who had anticipated the betrayal, executed Operation Oxy with lethal precision. Within days, they captured more than 650,000 Italian soldiers. Many generals were taken prisoner, others simply disappeared, removing their uniforms and taking refuge in anonymity. But there were those who chose to continue the war. General Raffaele Cadorna Jr., son of a World War I hero, joined the partisan resistance in northern Italy. From the mountains, he coordinated guerrilla operations against the Germans, partially redeeming the lost honor of the Italian army. In the north, Mussolini established the Italian Social Republic, a Nazi puppet state. Some generals chose loyalty to fascism over Italy. Marshal Rodolfo Graziani, known as the Butcher of Ethiopia for his brutal colonial campaigns, became Minister of Defense of the RSI. Graziani reorganized a new fascist army that fought alongside the Germans. He oversaw reprisals against partisans and civilians, ordered executions, and collaborated in the deportation of Italian Jews. His loyalty to Mussolini was unwavering, even when all was lost. When the war ended, Graziani attempted to surrender to the Americans, fearing partisan justice. General Renato Ricci, founder of the Opera Nazionale Ballia, the fascist youth organization, also remained with the regime until the end. These men believed, or wanted to believe, that they were saving Italy's dignity. History would judge them as traitors. When Italy was liberated in 1945, the country faced an impossible question: how to judge those responsible for 20 years of fascism and a disastrous war? The answer was disappointing. Graziani was arrested and tried in 1948. He was accused of collaboration with the Nazis and war crimes. However, the military tribunal sentenced him to only 19 years in prison. He served barely 4 months before being released for health reasons. The sentence outraged victims, but reflected an uncomfortable reality. Italy needed reconciliation, not vengeance. The Americans, in the midst of the Cold War, preferred a stable country to one divided by purges. Marshal Badoglio was never tried. Despite having served fascism for 2 decades and leading brutal campaigns in Ethiopia using poison gas, his role in the armistice protected him. He died in 1956 in his villa, honored as the man who saved Italy. General Mario Roatta, head of intelligence and responsible for atrocities in Yugoslavia and Greece, was arrested. But in 1945, he mysteriously escaped from prison. He lived the rest of his life in Spain under Franco's regime, never accounting for the civilian massacres he ordered. Even generals who committed documented crimes in Africa and the Balkans received symbolic sentences or none at all. Extradition requests from Yugoslavia, Greece, and Ethiopia were systematically ignored. Paradoxically, many fascist generals found a place in democratic Italy. The country needed military expertise to rebuild its armed forces in the context of NATO. Thus, officers who had served fascism were quietly reintegrated. It was a Faustian bargain, experience in exchange for amnesia. The case of General Giovanni Messa exemplifies this uncomfortable compromise. One of the Axis's most competent commanders in Africa, who had led Italian forces at the Battle of El Alamein and earned Rommel's respect, Messa became chief of staff of the new Italian army in 1953. He had been a convinced fascist, decorated personally by Mussolini, but also a professional soldier respected even by his former enemies. The British described him as a gentleman warrior. His reintegration was seen as pragmatic necessity, but it sent a clear message: competence trumped ideology, even if that ideology had cost tens of thousands of lives. Raffaele Cadorna, the partisan general, became a senator and a respected figure in the new republic. His choice to fight with the resistance granted him moral legitimacy that others never had. Yet even Cadorna found himself working alongside former fascist officers in parliamentary military committees. The irony was not lost on him. Men he had fought against in the mountains now sat beside him in Rome's halls of power, discussing Italy's defense strategy. The reintegration went deeper than just a few high-profile generals. Entire networks of mid-ranking officers who had served the regime found their way back into uniform. Colonel Cuneo Valerio Borghese, the notorious Black Prince who commanded the brutal Decima Mas unit during the Republic of Salo, was initially imprisoned but released in 1949. Though he never officially rejoined the military, he maintained close ties with intelligence services and would later attempt a coup in 1970. The shadows of fascism extended far into Italy's institutions. General Efficio Maras, who had served as military attaché in Berlin and maintained close relationships with Nazi leadership, was quietly employed in advisory roles. His expertise on German military thinking was deemed valuable during the early Cold War, when understanding the Soviet threat and potential German rearmament became paramount. Many junior officers simply continued their careers without interruption, changing uniforms but not mentalities. They brought with them the authoritarian culture of the fascist military. Rigid hierarchy, suspicion of civilians, and a deep-seated belief in the military's special role above politics. The democratization of the Italian army was a slow and painful process, resisted at every turn by those who had known only Mussolini's military. This institutional continuity had dangerous consequences. Authoritarian structures and anti-democratic thinking persisted for decades, as demonstrated by General Giovanni De Lorenzo's attempted coup d'état in 1964, known as Piano Solo. De Lorenzo, who had served under fascism, planned to arrest hundreds of politicians and establish military control if the political situation destabilized. The plan was discovered, but De Lorenzo faced no serious consequences. Another example of the impunity that protected military elites. The American presence complicated matters further. Washington, obsessed with containing communism, pressured Italy to rebuild its armed forces quickly. The fastest way to do so was to employ experienced officers, regardless of their past. The CIA even protected certain former fascist officers, seeing them as potential assets against the powerful Italian Communist Party. Ideology became fluid. Yesterday's fascist could become today's anti-communist. By the late 1950s, Italy had essentially recycled its military elite. The names had changed at the very top, but the middle ranks were filled with men who had worn black shirts before wearing NATO green. They trained a new generation of officers, passing down not just tactical knowledge, but also attitudes about power, politics, and the military's place in society. The ghosts of the Ventennio, the 20 fascist years, would haunt Italian barracks for decades to come. The story of Italian generals after World War II is a story of missed opportunities. Unlike Germany, Italy never conducted a true purge of its military elites. There was no Italian Nuremberg. Crimes committed in Africa, Greece, and Yugoslavia were deliberately forgotten. Graziani died in 1955, and in 2012, his hometown dedicated a mausoleum to him. The controversy it generated revealed that the wounds never fully healed. For some, these generals were patriots who served their country. For others, war criminals who escaped justice. The truth is more complex and darker. These men lived in an era of impossible choices. Some chose opportunism, others blind loyalty, and a few redemption through the resistance. But most simply survived, navigating between regimes, hoping that history would be generous with them. It wasn't. Italian historical memory continues to struggle with this past. Fascist generals were neither monsters nor heroes. They were men who made decisions that defined their lives and those of millions. Their fates remind us that historical justice is fragile, and that societies, in their haste to heal, often choose to forget rather than confront. Today, when we look at the faded photographs of those men in uniforms full of medals, we must ask ourselves, what would we do in their place? And more importantly, are we willing to demand accountability when the time comes, or do we prefer to look the other way, as Italy did in 1945? The answer to that question defines not only how we remember the past, but what kind of future we are willing to build.